Hey, Pipe, let's talk about Curl Cruz MMA today. We got a very special guest for you today. My guest is a former UFC fighter. He is the Punisher. He is Mr. Sean Pierson. Sean, what's going on, my friend? How are you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Just a lot of running around today, but now we're at it. So, let the fun stuff begin.
Let's go. So, man, you've been doing this involved in the world of combat sports for such a long time. You really started doing this before it was cool. I think people don't really realize, in this day and age, there's fights almost every single weekend. You have Fight Pass, you watch a regional show like 4 or 5 days out of the week. You have UFCs, PFLs, you have your bare knuckle stuff, your ones, your karate combats, all this stuff. But 25, 30 years ago, people were calling MMA human cockfighting. It was not legal at every single place. I've heard stories of guys fighting in bars, barns, outside, mystery opponents. When you first broke into this in the early days, do you have any crazy stories from the Wild Wild West days? Have you fought at a bar? Have you fought outdoors? Have you fought a mystery guy?
Are we talking about professionally or just,
we're talking professionally.
A 24-year-old, 25-year-old kid? Like, I don't know. That stuff did happen, but I think sometimes up here in Canada, I think some people tell stories. You know what I mean? Like, again, my first couple fights they weren't underground. They were on the native reserve out in Montreal. I think Quananaki is how I pronounce it. But that was the IFC early days, I think 99. I don't have my thing in front of me, but somewhere around there, 99, 2000. And I had like what they wanted to be in Ontario actually before that even. Like it was almost like I don't remember what they were calling it, pancration. But that didn't go very far. It was one of those where I remember double legging a guy to his back, and it was in Ontario somewhere. And I went to throw a punch, and he's like, "Nope, I'm out." And I'm like, "Okay, this is over." Early days were awesome. I'd say the Wild West for me portion of it was just it was illegal in Ontario. So we always say we're never the home team. I mean, every fight we had early on, and that's why there's a lot of gaps in my resume and why I sort of gave up for a while. They would typically tell me like at one point, Sean, it's hard to get you fights here because, I've got a guy here who's selling me 2,000, 3,000 tickets and you're coming from Ontario and again, I thought I did a pretty good job of selling 25, 30 tickets of my boys here in Ontario, but you're coming here to beat a guy up who basically, makes me a lot of money. So being the away team didn't always help as far as getting fights. We were the guys who were called last minute. I mean, wasn't in training camp. Hey, come fight. And I'm the idiot who was like, "Oh, you're going to pay me $3,000, $2,000 to come party." It sounds great. I'd get my guys, in a car and say, "Let's go fight and have a good time in Montreal." I love being there. So to me, fighting early on was like men's league hockey. I didn't take it seriously. I just loved to fight. I love combat sports. It was more of a, I thought I was king of the world, and I'm like, I was a wrestler at the time. And again, I was doing other stuff, but I just went down there and said, let's have a fight, get paid for it, and then go to the bar and try and pick up some girls. That was sort of, again, I'm 21-year-old, 22-year-old kid. I'm like, this is the, greatest thing in the world.
Absolutely. The sport obviously has come such a long way. Did you ever, when you first started getting into it, did you envision that would blow up to what it is today?
No, not at all. I knew there was potential to be a big sport, and just the fact that I was gravitated. I was the biggest fan. I was a fanboy more so than a fighter. I thought I watched every UFC. I knew every fighter. I watched early on. I watched every tough. I was actually going to be on that show at one point, but it was just so you saw the potential, and especially after the Bonner Griffin, it blew up right there. So you saw a lot of cool things happening, but there's still the paychecks were still, because I became a little older and realistic on, okay, most of us aren't making the money we need. And it was really tough to make a living, especially because I was at that point in my life where the first time I sort of retired, I don't even remember the year, but there's a gap there. And it was, I want to get married. I want to start a family, and I need a real job, like a full-time gig. So it was tough to, put time into fighting. And I still took fights every few months, again, just to go spoil myself a weekend in Montreal with the boys. But it wasn't a career choice for me. It was like, I can't make it. I didn't think there was a career path when I was younger in this. I just thought it was going to be, I'll be on my favorite memories early on where I'd win a fight, would go, remember the old, well, you're too young, but we had these illegal pay-per-view boxes where you would see it a week later. So if I won a fight, I'd have all the guys the next weekend, we'd be watching it. And then at one point I somehow got on Off the Record, and it became a regular on Off the Record on TSN. And I would try to always ask them for like a Thursday night or a Friday night, because we knew it would show at the bar. So I'd be at university and I do a Friday night, would go to like, it was either Isaac's on a Thursday or Big Bucks on a Friday. So if we're going to Big Bucks, and we knew it would be on the screen. So I'd be walking around the bar as my videos on the screen. But that, that's the life you live. You're trying to be a little mini like superhero in your hometown or wherever you are. You know what I mean? It wasn't about the money at the time. It was just sort of about, I thought it was a cool thing to do, and I enjoyed it. And I happened to be pretty good at it. At least in my head, I was. So,
there's so many different things that you could lean to or reasons why the sport has blown up. Obviously, I think the Fertittas played a big part. I think Dana White played a big part. Obviously, the rules, the legislation that Big John McCarthy did a lot of. You had the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. In your opinion, what was really the turning point, the catalyst that got this thing rolling in the right direction?
Well, it had to be tough. Like, it was just viewed so. I thought early on the big draw to the UFC was you knew the characters. Like, it's, again, I was a huge WWF fan or WWE fan, so I have to draw parallels. And the truth is, when you got to know people, you were invested. Right? That's my problem with it now. And again, I'm sure tons of people are way more invested in it right now than I am, but it's a little tougher for me to watch the earlier fights and stuff, only because I'm not invested in, the fighters or the characters. I don't know them. But before, when I was younger, I knew everybody. So I was invested to see, what's going to happen with Gracie versus Shamrock, or Dan Severn came in, Mark Coleman came in, Mark Kerr. I was like, oh my God, look at this guy. Like, I was so intrigued about what was going to happen. And back then it was still a little bit of this sport versus that sport. And that was intriguing as well. When now it's not about that. Now it's everybody does everything. Now someone can be, more of a striker, more of a wrestler, more of a jiu-jitsu guy. But at the end of the day, everything. Everybody in there has a full arsenal of weapons. Whether they're geared more towards one or the other is different, but they're well versed everywhere. They know to survive, you've got to be good at everything. So the sport's evolved, and it's really enjoyable when you see a high level fight. Especially as a fighter, you can really appreciate it.
When I first started growing up and when I was watching the sport at a young age, back then you wouldn't have as many fights, especially from the UFC. There wasn't as many promotions. You'd have that one big pay-per-view a month. You'd have maybe a fight night sprinkled in there in between. Now you're getting the product from so many different platforms on a weekly basis. It's hard to really keep up with it. I mean, it's a full-time job watching all the fights now. Do you feel there's a different mystique than it was maybe back in the 2000s, 2010s to what it is now?
So again, my thought process around this is, I'm going to use Canada as an example. I thought when I was fighting, maybe a little bit before that, the UFC was at its height in Canada. So like, as a popularity around, at least the people that I knew, it was a super popular. Everybody knew it. It was a huge draw. Now it went international. So I think overall the popularity of the UFC probably quadrupled in size. Again, I don't know numbers. In Canada, because of the amount of shows, I think to the average person, maybe the intrigue sort of died down a little bit because there was, I'm going to say, too many fights. I'm not saying that's true or not, but it seemed a little tougher to follow because, like you said, there was a UFC or an event every weekend. It wasn't like a build up to one big show. So I think there was a little bit of, there's too much going on. And then add in all the foreign fighters, like from, someone hadn't seen the guys from Kazakhstan come at first, or the guys from Japan, like, so they weren't invested yet in those personalities and in those fighters. So I think it went down in popularity. It seemed to go down in popularity a little bit, but I think in the overall picture, it grew in popularity because now instead of just being a North American product, which I think it originally started as a US Canada product, it blew up to an international product where you got guys watching across the world now, and even fighters across the world competing at the highest level. So I think overall, globally, this sport has grown tremendously thanks to Dana and everybody there. But I think the height of popularity in just Canada has died down a little bit. And that might come back with some of these fighters like Mike Mallet and a lot of these guys the truth is you had GSP here, who was arguably the best pound for pound fighter in the world. So, and he was Canadian. So there was a huge draw to that as well. And of course I was fighting. So a big draw there. Yeah.
One thing we're really seeing in the fight game now is the implementation of personality and entertainment. And I think it's always been there for an extent. I think Tank Abbott was one of those first guys to come around and really play like the heel role, if you will, the villain. You had Tito Ortiz, you had Ken Shamrock, you had Chael Sonnen. Conor McGregor comes around. I think everything is revolutionized. Now, you have social media. It's a prevalent thing. Guys are calling their shots on social media, uploading content every single day. And you're really starting to see the personality and entertainment side come out of these fighters. How do you feel personality and entertainment has affected mixed martial arts?
So, again, as a spectator, I think it's great. And, again, I don't know if you're like my early fights. I think I was one of the guys that sort of originated that. I used to be the pimp daddy or the pimp. I would walk out with girls. I'd have a hat, sort of like Khabib, a little bit like a fur hat. I had a pretty good persona and a pretty good image. And again, it came because I was a huge WWF fan. My favorite part of the fight was the walkout. I had a huge one against Steve Vigneault, a huge walkout. And I really enjoyed that part of the show. And what happened to me a little bit is actually before the UFC, I was sort of like the pimp image was, you can't do that. You can't do this. I was a dad at that point. So for me, one, people are telling me you can't do this, you can't do that. And then two, I'm like, okay, I can't act the same way. I want to act the same way as I did as a kid because I'm just a big kid. But at the same time, I do have a responsibility to my family and my kids to, again, like the world has changed, and what was acceptable in 2010 isn't acceptable now. That's just and I thought about things like that. Like, okay, maybe I was pushing it too far with the pimp daddy thing. I remember I stole my image a little bit from like a Buff Bagwell. I really like Buff Bagwell and the NWA and the Buff Bagwell. Like that was my thing. I'm like, I really liked wrestling at the time. So I tried to steal that. And then there used to be, I don't remember what his name was, but there was a guy called the Pimp or something in WWF that would come down with girls. And the truth is, I just loved women. So I'm like, listen, if you want to throw women, and it wasn't me getting them. The promoter would be like, Sean, we got girls to walk down with you. I'm like, awesome, let's do this. You know what I mean? It was fun.
Absolutely. I think a byproduct of the whole entertainment personality driven era of combat sports is something called the casual fan. So these are the people, they like to go to Boston Pizza, they like to go to Wild Wings, they like to get drunk, they like to yell twist them in the what, and have all these different comments. Overall, what's your thought process on these casuals?
Listen, you need the casuals. And the truth is, like, they're the biggest fans. I find the hardest thing with this sport in general is that everybody thinks they could do it or could have done it. And I find it very weird. I don't watch a football game and think to myself, if I had to pick football, I would have been a football star. But you ask somebody in the bar if they could have fought in the UFC or fought at a high level. A lot of times, again, I don't really watch in bars anymore, but I used to watch all the time Boston Pizzas, Wild Wings. Like you said, I used to always go to those type of places. And there'd always be a guy telling me that, it's funny because they'd usually be younger than me. Hey, if this was around in my day, I think I would have done this. And I'd be like, oh, I for sure. And meanwhile, the guy's probably 6 years younger than I am. Like, the truth is, I had retired, stopped fighting, working at Dell Computers, everything. And I remember sitting on my couch, and it was, I don't remember what UFC it was, but Steve Vigneault, a guy that I had fought a bunch of times in my career, walked out to fight Mike Swick. And I just thought to myself, like, why, Steve continued to chase his dream because he started, my first fight was against him, and he made the UFC. And I remember I was about 34 years old. I'm just guesstimating my age right there, maybe 33, I don't know. And I just looked over at my wife and said, listen, I need to, you know what you do? I just felt like an underachiever. I'm like, why did I quit? Like, I think I could have made it. I always felt like I could have made it. But again, I'm one of those people who thinks I can do everything. So, but my wife's like, hey, then you got to commit to it. And at that point I sort of committed, and it just so happened I had a fight. So I took a couple more fights. And then my big break for me was actually, I was fighting Fabio Holanda, and Dave Wazo, who's a friend of mine, called me up and goes, hey, George wants to talk to you. So, it's George St. Pierre. And I'm like, okay, cool. And George said, hey, listen, I want you to come train with me. And I don't remember the exact time. I think that was because after that, I started training with them a lot. The TriStar guys had me up there a lot. That was sort of like my second home, especially for fights, like Faraz. All the guys there were really brought me in and made me feel like it was my home gym, like outside of home. But he wanted to train me, and I trained with George. I think Dan Hardy, he was fighting Dan Hardy at the time. So I remember I don't know if that was the exact time or not, but because I think at that point, what was that show that used to be called? There used to be a filming of a show that George and them would do, like before big fights. I thought it was a cool show. It was like oh man, do you remember the show I'm talking about? Where it was just like a build up to the fight.
It was kind of like the UFC Countdown, right?
Yeah, and it was a cool build up to the fights they used to do. And I remember I was in George's, a couple times for that fight with Dan Hardy. But anyways, that was my break because I remember training with George and the guys. And George one day just goes, listen, you know that you're as good as a lot of the guys that I fought in the UFC. If you stick with this, like, I think you can do it. And to hear somebody else tell you what you already believe in your head, it's sort of like, especially at that point, George was champ. You know what I mean? I'm like, I appreciated that, and it sort of just kept me saying, yeah, I'm gonna get this done. And then at 34, I finally got the call. Joe Silva's like, hey, Matt Riddle just lost an opponent. Or he actually didn't even tell me Matt Riddle at first. He goes, hey, we have an opening at UFC 124 in Montreal. I think it's in 3 weeks. Can you do the fight? And I said yes, and we hung up. Then he called me right back and goes, okay, well, do you want me to tell you who your opponent is? I'm like, oh, yeah. And he goes, it's Matt Riddle. I'm like, okay, great. I didn't know who Riddle was at the time, but I was like, this is awesome. I was so excited, told my wife, I was like, okay, we're going to the UFC. So that was my break, UFC 124 at the Bell Center. And great, one of my favorite stories for my kids and stuff like that. Just like, listen, just chase your dreams. You know what I mean? You're never too old to do anything. If your mind's set, just go for it.
In my opinion, one of the big, I think, moments in mixed martial arts that really showed a change in the positive direction was UFC 129. The first show in Ontario, 50,000 plus people in there. It was one of the first times in North America they did a show in front of an audience like that. You were lucky enough to be part of that card. What was it like walking out, seeing all that, and, just being part of that event?
It was a great event. For me, it was a love-hate event. I lost my fight at that event, which again, it happens. I'm not one of those guys who, it's not the end of the world. You know what I mean? Yeah, obviously it's unfortunate, but I was like, the harder part for me was just the anxiety up until, because I had lost my opponent. I was supposed to fight Mark Foster. And then I want to say about a week out, I might be off. It might be a week and a half, but they said, unfortunately, Mark, he can't fight. And I was like, oh, okay. They tried for a couple of days to get me another opponent. And remember, so like you said, this is the first ever fight in Ontario. I'm an Ontario fighter. I've sold a lot of tickets. A lot of my friends are all excited to go here. I've got sponsorships, and they couldn't get me a fight. And I was like, oh, man, God. And then they came back, and Joe Silva says, hey, Sean, I've got a fight for you. It might not be Jake. It's your second fight in the UFC. He goes, it's Jake Ellenberger. And there were some mixed feelings from the people that I go, because I'm my own manager. And that's a mistake too that I wouldn't do again. But it is what it is. But my ego got in the way, and I think it was the right decision. But I had people definitely tell me you shouldn't take this fight, your second fight in. I even think Joe Silva was like, it's a tough one. Basically telling me but I'm 34, 35 years old. I'm here to, it is what it is. You know what I mean? And I wanted to be a part of that show, right? It's the first ever show in Ontario. I'm like, it's why I deserve to be on this show. So I took the fight. The walkout was amazing. The people, the atmosphere was amazing. The buildup was awesome. I threw out a pitch at a Blue Jays game. So to me, that's incredible. Me and Mark Hominick. So a great experience, like no regrets. And I remember afterwards, some of the guys, because we had a big after party, and hey, Sean, I'm so sorry. I'm like, don't be sorry, man. I just fought in front of 50,000 people. A year ago today, I was working at Dell Computers, which again, not a bad thing, but I mean, I'm living the dream right now. It's not a big deal. I'll bounce back.
So
cool experience.
In this day and age, so many people are watching the sport, and I think the casual fans, for the most part, have an understanding what these guys are doing. Training, try to win fights, get more money, win belts, move up in the rankings, yada yada yada. But very few of them understand the sacrifices that a fighter has to go through. When you're battling it out on the regional scene, trying to go to the big shows, you're not making millions of dollars. A lot of guys have to have the 9-to-5 jobs. You have to pay to train, stay up late, wake up early, miss birthdays, weddings, Thanksgivings, dinners. You might have a kid, you might have a girlfriend in there. All that stuff gets very complicated. Just maybe for the chance to be in the top 1% here and fight in the bigger shows. You've done it for a long time. You knew what it was like fighting on the regional scene to make it. I'm sure you had those days where it's the greatest thing ever, it's the loneliest thing ever, it's the worst thing ever. What made you want to stick through and keep going with it?
I'll be honest. It was just the dream that I thought I could be a pro fighter. Like the dream that I thought I could, because again, my definition of pro is different than others. Like to me, if you fight on a regional show and you get paid, I don't consider that a pro. That was just you're getting paid because you're in there. But to me, once you can afford to make a living and support the family or support yourself, that's a professional. So that was my dream, was to try and be a pro athlete. And I believed in myself, and my wife believed in me. And I had a big support staff. Like even my friends, the guys I trained with, I got to give everybody the credit they deserve, because it's not just one guy. And that you've talked to 1,000 fighters. To me, it was my whole team, like saying, yeah, like, Sean, we think you got something here. Like everybody believed in me. And I'm one of those guys, when other people believe in me, I want to prove them right. Like, I don't want to let people down. I think that's my biggest thing. That's why when you bring people to fights, it's not the loss that kills you. It's thinking that you let everybody down. Do you mean you're just there you want everybody to have a good time after the fight? And if everybody's down because I lost a fight, that's not what I was about. Like, to me, it was like I told you back, even when I first started this, it was about going to party in Montreal and hang out with all my boys and meet new people. And that's what I looked forward to the most. The fight was the fight. I've been in 1,000 or more wrestling matches. It is what it is, right? It's not life or death situation.
When I was growing up, obviously you had Zahabi over in Montreal and TriStar. You had Hominick and the boys in London at All Stars over there. Those were the two big powerhouses, in my opinion, at Canada. You had those names, obviously the George St. Pierre's, the Rory McDonald's, you had the Chris Clemences, the Ronsons. Your name was in there. Mark Hominick was in there. Chad Laprise was in there. What was it like to be part of that crop that helped pave the way, grow the sport in Canada, now aspiring the Malats, the Jazz Duaviciuses, and the other ones that are doing this today?
It's funny, because sometimes I feel like, again, I definitely feel like I was part of that group, and sometimes I used to feel like I wasn't. And only because after it was all done, most of the guys stayed around the sport very tight and either opened up a gym or they had other fighters. When I sort of had a different, like, even when this all started with Shaw Franco, Justin Bruckman, Richard Nanku, Antonio Carvalho, and that crew of our Toronto guys, I was a little bit separated from everybody because I was at university. So even though we all sort of started together, eventually I'd have to go back to university. I had a wrestling, I was a big wrestler. Where they're all still training to fight, I was sort of wrestling. And then every once in a while I would take a dumb fight because I had a weekend off and be like, I'm ready, let's go. I hadn't really trained anything other than wrestling. But again, it was a good time in Montreal I was looking forward to. But I think the exciting part is that, I learned a lot from watching other fighters. That's how we all sort of learned back in the day. So an appreciation for the guys in London, like Mark Hominick came in, and I think his nickname was the Machine. I might be off a little bit, but just a cardio machine. Like, that's where, like, I'd look at him and be like, oh my God, look at this kid's cardio. Like, just nonstop, go, 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 go. The guys in Montreal, like, I think I was a judge on one of George's first fights. It was an amateur fight. It was at a Le Cage bar in Montreal. And you knew right away, I'm like, this guy's an athlete. Like, obviously he was new, but he won fairly easily and just athletic. So you knew he was going to be someone. You know what I mean? Like, you knew he was on the scene. He could come on pretty quickly. It was a great experience coming up. That if I could look back, the things that we all made mistakes on is we all fought each other for peanuts. When I look at the sport now, and it's got to be a little bit like boxing. And again, I'm not going to say this is good or bad, but people now build their records. And you come up like that, because the one problem with the sport is this is going to sound wrong, but it's not always a true sport. Like who gets a title fight and who doesn't get a title fight is not based on skill level. That's the part where I have a little bit of trouble with fighting. When you think to myself, like Khabib should have had a title fight way before he did. I feel like people didn't want to fight him. He was an ugly match for a lot of people. And I don't know if the UFC, again, I don't know what the UFC is thinking, but I think early on, I don't know if they thought he was going to make a champion that could sell a lot of tickets or not. So, because I felt earlier than he did, I thought he was a force. Like when I was fighting, he was in there, and I was like, this guy is, his wrestling, to be that wrestling heavy and have that good a cardio being wrestling heavy, which we see a lot more now, but that was impressive. Most guys that were wrestling heavy, I believe wrestling is the hardest part of mixed martial arts. When I say hard, like the hardest on your cardio system. So when people are so wrestling heavy, you usually see them gas out pretty hard, and he would just keep going and going. And even back then, to me, that was very impressive. So yeah, I just feel like the sport sometimes evolves around who's popular, not necessarily who's deserving. But as a fan, I understand it. Like if Conor was to fight, I know he just knocked some guy out at the bar the other day, but if he had a title fight tomorrow, I'd be watching. He's entertaining to me. I enjoy him. So I get it. I get both sides of it.
It's amazing to see how the scene has blew up in Canada. Now you have different promotions, like you have Battlefield out west, you have Samurai in Quebec, you have Unified, all these big regional shows that are on Fight Pass, sending guys to the UFC and the bigger shows. Is it amazing now to look at it and see all these opportunities for younger fighters in Canada?
It's really good. I think the next step is to get an amateur circuit, like a proper amateur circuit up and running, because I still think most of the time these low on the regional circuit, the entry level fights, I feel like a lot of times those guys aren't ready. And again, I can say the same thing about me. I don't know if I was ready. I won my first few, but I don't know if I was ready. It just, we were all in the same boat because that's all there was. I think creating an amateur program would help Canada and help the province of Ontario. And again, just getting the same sanctioning body to run things and make sure everything's safe for the kids. And maybe there's a little bit of that already. Again, I'm not fully in the scene. I know we're working with some guys right now to try and put some of the legislative together. But I just think creating an environment where everybody can succeed is the key here, right? Because at the end of the day, like the one thing I've realized is even like I look at the way we used to spar as kids. Like when we were first in the sport, small gloves, swing away. We were just fighting each other for no money. Like, I don't want to say we're idiots, but we're idiots. Versus, you know what I mean? Just learning the sport. And I see it now. Like I see the Bruckman guys over there, and that's why, there's a lot of people doing it, but I know Justin, the guys well, but where they're training, not every sparring session has to be, let's take this guy's head off. So things are changing a lot because concussions are a real thing. And obviously in this sport, they're pretty hard to avoid. But limiting your exposure to them is key, right? And when you do have one, understanding why you have it, how it happened, and how long you need to get off before you come back to the sport is key.
I think another figure that was instrumental for the growth of the MMA in Canada was Showdown Joe Ferraro. I mean, obviously, if you're growing up, if you're watching at that time frame, he had his show on Sportsnet. I think he started off at the 590. That was really the first personality that we've seen that really in Canada that really went hardcore into martial arts. You have the opportunity, in addition to fighting, to do some of that, the TV stuff, the commentary stuff, the analyst work. What was it like doing that stuff with Joe?
I loved it. I'll be honest, at one point I thought that might be a career move for me after the UFC. Try and either go with Joe or start something else. But that was my thought process. And it's still like, again, I bang things around in my head all the time about like, I do IT consulting right now for a company, which I enjoy. But I would like to be more involved again with mixed martial arts. So I always think to myself, okay, is it opening up a gym on the side? Right now I just train people on the side. But how do I get more involved? And I always look for opportunities like that. I think, speaking in front of the camera and talking about what I love is obviously easy for me because I'm passionate about it. But it was a great experience. Joe gave me some opportunities there. Joe was always a big supporter of the Canadian scene, me personally, and the whole Canadian scene. He always wanted to promote it. And I thought that show was great. Unfortunately, I think what happened is TSN bought the rights to the UFC at one point. So Sportsnet lost their show when everything went to TSN, and TSN was more, I think at the time, just taking content that was created by the UFC and replaying it on their channel rather than having their own show with their own, costs. They were like, we're just going to buy UFC and promote that. Now I believe it's back. Well, I know it's back with Sportsnet now, but Joe had a great show there, a great program. And right now there's a bit of a gap there. I think there is an opportunity for someone to pick up, or Joe to come back and do a show. If they're, again, obviously I don't make these calls, but I think it's a show that would be well watched again.
One thing that's really interesting about you retired having a 3-fight win streak in the UFC. What was the decision to give it up?
A couple of things were factors. One, it was getting difficult to get a fight. So I had asked to be on a Vancouver card. For some reason, they just couldn't grab me an opponent. And then, my biggest opportunity was actually going to happen, but it was on it was like a 3 weeks notice. They asked if I wanted to fight Damian Maia, but it was in Brazil. But my problem, it was 3 weeks. I couldn't be ready in 3 weeks. My people just said, listen, Sean, it's unfair to you. Like, you can't. I usually just take every fight and I'm like, let's do it. But I know how good Damian is. I thought it was an interesting fight for me just because I believe in myself, but I thought wrestling wise, I felt like, okay, I'm going to be difficult to deal with the takedown. I thought my striking was a little better than his. Obviously he's got great grappling. Again, anything can happen in a fight. He'd obviously be the favorite, but I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I asked, can we move that fight to Vancouver? But he had to headline in Brazil. He's a big draw in Brazil. So then I didn't take the Brazil fight in 3 weeks. I think Vancouver was about 6 weeks after that or something, around that time frame. They couldn't get me a fight. We were pregnant with my second child. And I just thought, I guess, the writing's on the wall. I'm 39 or 38 years old at the time. And I'm like, maybe this is it. Maybe I should, leave on a high note rather than being forced out. You know what I mean? Like how a lot of fighters are, unfortunately, where, they take a couple too many fights. And then they go to the regional circuit and take more fights. And I just find the difficult part and I had a little bit of this, but not as much. But as a fighter or as an athlete, you identify as that athlete. And I find it very difficult for people when they retire or when they should retire to separate themselves as Sean Pierson and Sean Pierson the fighter. But because I already had like a fallback, like, again, I was doing IT consulting for Dell Computers. I work for another company called Gilera, and now I'm with Technicore. I had something where I knew I could go. Like, I could make a living in another way, and I identify as a dad and a husband more than I did a fighter at that point in my career. So I had other things to sort of drive towards. Now, it was difficult because, I didn't want to be that fighter. I wanted to be the superstar. But at the same time, where I thought to myself is I can now put that into my kids and let my wife shine, let my kids shine, and I just support them the best I can. And, both my kids have been doing amazing in sports and school, and that's my new goals, and I'm proud of that.
Since your departure from the UFC, another big craze in combat sports that's been picking a lot of steam is the bare knuckle world, whether it be bare knuckle boxing, bare knuckle mixed martial arts now. Did you ever at one point consider that after the UFC?
I don't think it came a little ways after my departure, but I don't think I would have considered it because most of the guys that go to it when they're cut from the UFC because there's good money there now. I don't know if the money would have been there when I was retiring, but I think it's another problem. It's again, I'm not bashing bare knuckle fighting. I think it's the same as mixed martial arts. You just take the gloves away, for the most part. But I find what's happening is I don't like to see fighters that are after their career is over, they're no longer in their prime, even well beyond their prime. I just feel like we're hurting ourselves. And I understand why, because they don't have another way to make that kind of a living and that kind of cash flow. So it's a hard situation and it's hard to turn away from. Same reason why Ben Askren fought, YouTube boy. Jake Paul. I didn't think that was a good fight for him. Like, I don't know if he'd ever thrown a punch in a UFC fight in his life. I was told he just came off hip surgery, but the payday he must have received is life-changing. So I understand why he took it, but it's just another opportunity to get a concussion with long-term problems. And you see a lot of these fighters that after their career, they're looking for that payday, which is unfortunate because they all should have been paid well enough while they were fighting where they didn't need it. But because I feel the sport's been so underpaid for so long, a lot of the guys, those were guys, they had good careers. It's not like Ben Askren was, didn't do well. He did very well. A lot of those guys did very well, but they were looking for that one last payday because they weren't paid as if they were a hockey player, an NBA player, like, you know what I mean? And again, there's lots of reasons why that's not happening. But the point being is if they were paid really well, I don't think they would have taken those chances. Same thing with bare knuckle fighting. I think if the UFC fighters that go over to bare knuckle fighting were paid properly to that point in their career, I don't know if bare knuckle fighting would have taken off like it did. Because it got some good UFC names that went over there. Some won, some lost, but they needed extra paydays.
I joke around with Jesse Ronson about this a lot of times. He fights on Saturdays a lot. And I said, well, Jesse, I don't know how many people are going to watch you fight because they're all watching the Maple Leafs up north. Do you ever think we're going to get to a time in Canada? Is hockey always going to be king? Could MMA come and surpass it ever?
I don't think hockey will always be king. I don't think you ever need it to surpass anything because I was the biggest UFC fan in the world, but I'm also a huge hockey fan. There's plenty of room for it's like when people always get paranoid when a new gym comes into town and they're like, oh, fighting over territory. I'm like, there's enough people here. If you do a good job in your business, everyone here can survive. Same thing with athletics. Like people want to watch a diversity of different things. So if there's a huge UFC event on a night of a hockey game, but it's a huge event and you're drawing me to it, I'm going to watch the UFC event. If it's the Stanley Cup Finals, the UFC shouldn't go on that night if you want to draw in Canada. You know what I mean? Especially if it's a Canadian team playing. But both can survive. I don't see MMA taking over hockey up here. Just like MMA is not going to take over football down in the U.S. Again, I'm assuming football is the highest watched sport. I'm not 100% sure on that in the U.S., but I know it's huge. But both can survive just fine and still pull huge numbers.
One thing I love about martial arts, it invokes so many disciplines, so many life lessons. I've had so many fighters tell me martial arts saved my life. It instilled values and made me the person who I am today. Through your journey, how have you grown as a person? What have you learned through combat sports?
The one thing I've learned is you'll never stop learning. The greatest thing about this sport is it's being a part of it when it was just starting, I'm going to say, was great because the evolution of mixed martial arts, again, karate was established, judo's established, wrestling's established, boxing's established, but as a mixed martial art, bringing all this stuff together, it was all brand new. You see people pulling off moves where, people would say, oh, karate doesn't work in a fight or this doesn't work in a fight. You can never pull this off. Well, people are pulling that stuff off now because they're so diverse with their skill sets that now they're starting to incorporate things that you might not anticipate. Do you mean like I remember when at one point no one's ever going to hit a spinning round kick, and then who's the Brazilian guy that Barbosa hit that kick, and then everybody's like, oh my god, everybody wanted to do it. When Pettis jumped off the wall, like people are creative, right? So, and that's the greatest thing about this sport is it just evolves, right? It just continues to grow and continue to change and. Again, every sport is like that, but you see a drastic change in our sport just because it's so new, right? Like I look at hockey, my kids both play hockey, and we look at the Michigan move from when I was a kid was like, oh my god, that was impossible. Most of these elite 10-year-old kids can all do it. I see my kid practice picking the puck up, dumping it in nonstop just for fun. And I still was, I don't think I could do it in a game, not without getting my head taken off. Absolutely. So the sports evolve, and I think that's fun to watch.
Absolutely. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. This sport, what is it, 30, 35 years old at the absolute most, just thinking, what is this going to be like another 20, 25 years from now?
No, I agree 100%. And even the little sports that have jumped off of like karate combat is what it is because of the UFC, because we're like, okay, let's do this. Now the UFC's actually got, a no-gi, like a grappling tournament competition that they're trying to push. I know the UFC is trying to get into boxing, but all these sports are evolving a little bit off of the popularity because boxing was dying down a bit. And I was a big boxing fan too. I was a huge Roy Jones Jr. He was my favorite boxer growing up. Obviously, I'm an Ali fan. I'm wearing a shirt right now. But I love boxing. So, you know what I mean? To me, I always got offended when people would be like, boxing sucks compared to this, or boxing won't work, or wrestling won't work. I was always like, you know, those are small-minded people. I'm like, no one discipline. At the end of the day, it's the athlete, right? Like, the athlete is the one who wins. It's not necessarily the discipline, because usually they've learned a little bit of all these disciplines. They might be better at it one versus another. But even when you see like Adesanya, when it's, you know, the kickboxing's back. Well, kickboxing never left. You just have a guy who's a high-level kickboxer who's great at defending takedowns, who could survive on the ground, is now able to utilize his art a little better. And the sport goes in waves. You know, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, then it was wrestling, then it was kickboxing, then Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like it's going to continue to do that as the sport evolves. And I think that's really cool.
You know, I think one thing that's so amazing now is, you know, I think for so long the sport was so fringe. People were scared to do it. You're seeing kids at 6 years old doing jiu-jitsu now. I mean, they're wrestling at 10, 11 years old. You know, some of them are doing youth MMA. By the time they're 18, they're starting amateur contests. You're seeing guys in the UFC now at 21, 22, 23 years old. Is this part of the reason why we're seeing the increased skill level now with these guys?
Well, 100%. Rory McDonald was actually, to me, one of the first guys where, you know, from early on, he was training everything. And again, I'm sure there's a better example somewhere, but a Canadian boy that, you know, I was a big supporter of, and I trained a little bit with him, but he was well-rounded from day one, right? He did jiu-jitsu. He wrestled. I think jiu-jitsu and striking were his two strongest, but I remember when he came out to Montreal, he was going to the wrestling club with us all the time. So, like, he was well-rounded from the start, when most of us had started somewhere. Like, I was a wrestler first. I did some judo, but that was my background, was wrestling. And then I didn't really start a boxing class until maybe 2 fights before the UFC. I found Grant Brothers MMA, this guy, RG, Ryan Grant, and we really clicked. And I got excited to box. And I think I was talking earlier to my buddy. He goes, Sean, you didn't go wrestling heavy in any of your UFC fights. And before the UFC, it was all wrestling. And I said, it's because I found a new toy. I'm just a big kid who, you know, now fallen in love with boxing. As I always loved the sport, but I never really did it. So now I'm doing it every day and I'm falling in love with it. So it's like, that's what I want to go showcase. Whether it's the right decision or not, I can't tell you, but I was, you know, training with high-level boxers a lot, getting great instruction. And I was like, I always thought to myself, I'm going to counter wrestle, because that's where I was. As a wrestler, I was a counter wrestler. So I'm like, I'm going to avoid takedowns, and I'm going to punch people out. That's what I'm going to try and do. And as soon as I realized it's not a good decision, maybe I'll switch to wrestling. But I never really switched strategies once I got to the UFC. It was just like, well, live and die by the sword. Let's do this.
All right, Sean, last question for you, my friend. What are you up to these days, man? What's the message you want to get across, and what's Sean Pierson like in 2025?
Listen, I hope I'm a super dad. That's what I do. I show for my kids around. I've got a 16-year-old and an 11-year-old. They play hockey and lacrosse, and I just love following them around. I do some training. I train some hockey players on, you know, how to fight a little bit. I do some youth as far as self-defense, just personals and privates, because I enjoy the sport. But maybe I'm going to open up something soon. I've always thought about, you know, should I open up a gym or become a head trainer at a gym? And lately, it's just been hitting me a lot more how much I miss the sport. So,
absolutely. Well, hey, Sean, thank you so much for your time. And, you know, thank you for being one of those guys that helped pave the way for other Canadians, for other martial arts in general, who will go out there and kind of blow this up to what it is today. I really appreciate it, my friend.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for supporting us and through my journey. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. That's it for us tonight. I'm Carl Peruzza. He is the Punisher. He is Mr. Sean Pierson.
I'm more the pimp daddy. No.